So, we're in the middle of a series on free will, and the last section that we started a couple of days ago is scientific challenges to free will, but scientific with a strong philosophical component. And the first we talked about was the idea that human beings' existence, nature, development, character, qualities are all completely caused by DNA plus environment, nature plus nurture, total, complete, absolute causation. And we asked whether there was any good reason to believe that, and we argued that there is no good reason to believe that. Influence, yes, but total causation, no. The second argument that we are dealing with now is the conviction, often aggressively expressed in the scientific community, that the human being is nothing but a body, a physical body, and physical body is nothing but a mechanical system, as some put it, a protoplasm machine, as opposed to a metal and optics machine. And because it is a protoplasm machine, so then it operates on purely mechanical principles, and purely mechanical principles don't allow for the possibility of free will. That's the second challenge. Now, we started to examine that second challenge by asking, what evidence is there that the totality of the human being is only physical? In particular, in terms of consciousness, what evidence is there that consciousness just is what the brain does, which is by far the most popular scientific conviction. And I'm using the word conviction decidedly, because that's all it is. What reason would they offer to support the idea that consciousness is nothing but brain activity? Consciousness is in the brain. It's just what the brain does. Like the stomach does digestion, the way John Searle puts it. So the brain does consciousness. And I would say almost the single type of evidence that is offered is a correlation between qualities of experience or events of experience on the one hand and brain events on the other hand. Auditory processing is accompanied by brain activity here. Visual processing is accompanied by brain activity there. Emotions occur when brain activity is operating in another place. And this you can test with MRI and fMRI and other types of technical devices inside to observe when and where the brain is operating. Of course, this is very imperfect and it's immature, and the claimed correlations are not true, but I'm leaving that aside. I'm not going to the empirical attack now. Let's suppose that you had a correlation. Of course, the correlation is established by asking people what they're experiencing. You have no independent access to that. You see the brain light up over here, you say, what's happening? Two things. The left front molar. And you say, okay, left front molar, color this red, okay? That's where it happens. You get the correlation by asking people what they're experiencing. But that's all right. They know what they're experiencing, and they can report it to you. Now, the question is whether evidence of widespread correlation is evidence of identity. Indeed, usually when you say, I have a widespread correlation between A and B, usually you're assuming that A is A, B is B, and they're correlated. You don't normally go from A and B are correlated to A and B are the same thing. We have a correlation between lightning and thunder. But lightning is not thunder, thunder is not lightning. Lightning is the transmission of electrons through the atmosphere, and thunder is sound waves in the atmosphere caused by lightning. As far as I'm aware, only mammals have body hair, and only mammals give birth to live young. So there's a correlation between body hair and giving birth to live young, but body hair is not live young, and live young is not body hair. They're correlated with one another. If science is going to go from a correlation between experience and brain events to saying that experience is what the brain does, it owes us some more explanation. It owes us some reason to make that jump, because it is not a jump implied by the evidence. Well, as a matter of fact, science sometimes does discover the identity of things. That does happen in science. And it happens in a way which is generally accepted, and which I think philosophy, as far as I know, philosophy of science is not critical of. So the thought now is, let's see if we can analyze how science does succeed on occasion in discovering the identity of something, and then see if we could use that same process to fill in the gap with the relationship between experience and the brain. If we could mimic those successful cases of scientific identification in the relationship between the consciousness and the brain, we may have a good reason to conclude that, in fact, consciousness is what the brain does. So, the project is to start to analyze how science does it when it does it, and then to see whether it can be transferred to higher circumstances. That's the project. Yesterday we started with one example, which I said 1 out of 2, where you do have successful identification. So science succeeds in telling us what something is, and that's where science discovered that sound is airwaves, systematic motions of air particles. And the way in which it's done, and none of this is my material now, this is standard philosophy of science. The way that's done is this. Before the discovery, let's say 200 years ago, what do people know about sound? Well, they knew an awful lot about what sound does. They knew what sorts of events cause sound, like banging on things, or fires burning, or rubbing on a string like in a violin, or yelling, or lots of events that cause sound. And there are lots of effects that sound has, like causing auditory experiences in people. And when the soprano hits a high note and the crystal vase cracks because of her high note, so the high note broke the vase. And sometimes when the double bass is turned up, you can feel vibrations that the sound is making. So we know a great deal about what causes sound and what effects sound has. We also know that whatever sound is, it behaves a lot like a physical thing. For example, if you build a soundproof room and you bang a drum inside the room, outside you won't hear anything. The walls stop it from getting out. It's sort of characteristic of physical things, that walls can stop it from getting out. Or when you bang a drum outside, the farther away you are, the dimmer the sound, because the sound gets weaker with distance, which is characteristic of physical effects. Or sounds bounce, as everyone knows from echoes. Bang a drum here, there's a wall there, and somebody hears it over there, as if it were over there, because the sound bounced off the wall and he heard it. So sounds do things like physical objects do. If you imagine yourself 200 years ago, you think, okay, whatever the sound is, it certainly behaves like a physical thing. We know a lot about what it does. But what is it? I'm in a room, 200 years ago, I'm in a room, he's got a drum over there, he's banging on the drum, and I hear it. Yeah, but what's going through the drum to me? I don't see anything going, I don't feel anything going, you know. He bangs the drum there, and he hears it over there. I don't feel a breeze in front of my face, or the sound going by. I mean, I have no clue what this physical thing is. And that's what science is looking for. Science is looking for what this physical thing is. It's looking for an identity. And here's how you justify it when you find it. You say, 200 years ago, make a list of everything we know about sound. The list will contain everything we know about what sound does, because that's all we know. Then somebody says, okay, for you, your whole concept of sound, your whole understanding of sound is Sound is, like I said twice before, the thing, whatever it is, that does all this. That's your whole concept of it. It's the thing that does all this. Now scientists come along, and one by one they say, look, systematic motions of air particles do each one of these things. They cause your auditory experiences, and they cause vibrations in the things around you, and if they're at a certain level, they can break vases, and these air motions can bounce off walls, and because they're air motions, they're a sealed container, like a sealed room, they won't get out. One by one, scientists show that these airwaves do all of the things that we know that sound does. And then we say, since that's all we know about sound, and for us to start with, sound is whatever does all those things, so then it's a very fair conclusion that this is sound, because this does all those things. That's a reasonable form of argument. Not infallible, but it's a reasonable form of argument. Take a simple example with which you're probably much more familiar. What is the carrier of hereditary information? Mendel in the 1830s did experiments with pea plants and showed that if you combine them in certain ways, you get certain percentages of offspring with certain percentages of characters, and it's systematic and regular. Something's transmitting information to the next generation. What you call it, genes, or germ plasma, whatever term you give it. There's something they're doing that. What is it? No clue. It's microscopic after all. They didn't have that access to microscopic reality at that time. Not in terms of human cells. Watson and Crick discovered that the carrier of genetic information, okay, there's epigenetics now and all the rest of the variations, I'm aware of that, is the DNA. So they discovered what this genetic material is, because up until then, the genetic material was the thing that carries the information from generation to generation. It's the thing that does this job. And now they discovered that the DNA does the job, then it's fair to conclude that the DNA is the genetic information. The pattern here is you have what's called a functional concept. The whole concept describes the function of something. And as Thomas Nagel puts it, that means that this concept sort of has a hole in the center. It's the thing that does all of this, whatever that thing is. So your concept of the thing already makes room for the discovery. The concept of sound is whatever does all this, leaving open to someone to discover what the whatever is. So if somebody finds something that does all this, it's fair to say that this is what sound is. That's one type of discovering what something is. This is a review of yesterday. Are we all together? Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. I'm only talking about sound that's transmitted through air, but you could generalize it and say that sound is systematic waves of a certain type in the material that's carrying the sound. That's true. I'm sorry, that's right. I said air, but sound travels through water even better than through air, and it travels through solids also. So I should have agreed. Okay, now there's another type of discovering what something is, which isn't identical to the way it's done in sound, and we have to look at that now. Let's talk about discovering what water is. Water is H2O. Here, the concept of water is not like the concept of sound. The concept of water is not whatever does certain functions. I have water in my cup. I have samples of water. Whatever else you're going to say about water, it's got to include the samples that we know are water. In the case of sound, you don't have any samples. You don't have any samples of the sound. That's why we said, what is sound 200 years ago? I don't know. It's the thing that does all these functions. With water, it's not just something that does a lot of functions. We also have samples of it. Which means that the job of asserting and justifying that water is H2O is more complicated. Here you have some functions. You definitely have functions. We know what things that water does. It enables plants to grow, and it enables people to live and survive, and it dissolves certain things like salt and sugar, and if you heat it up, then it boils, and if you it condenses out of water vapor, and there are lots of things that water does. We know those. If you have a list of all the things that water does, that's parallel to sound. But in addition to the list of things that water does, we've got samples. So when somebody wants to argue, as science successfully did, that water is H2O, it has a double job. It has to show that H2O does all the things that water is supposed to do. And also it has to show that H2O is what's in my cup. Now the way they do that is, if you pass an electric current through water, it will dissociate into hydrogen and oxygen. So, the thought is, the electric current is just prying apart things that are stuck together in water. Water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. And electric current, the energy of electric current is prying them apart, and that's why you get the two gases when you pass electric current through it. And that shows you that the water is actually composed of hydrogen and oxygen, sort of pulling it apart to look at its elements. So in the case of water, you do a double job. Check the functions and verify that the samples are made the way you claim. Now, considering what you said yesterday, I'm going to use it to illustrate why you need both. Let's imagine that the two efforts came apart. Let's suppose you had one without the other. Suppose that you had that H2O makes plants live and puts out fires and conducts electricity and dissolves sugar and salt and so forth and so on. But when I do chemical tests on the water in the cup, I get an entirely different picture. The direct analysis of the electrons and the protons, and it's sulfur quadroxide or something else, something entirely different. That happened, I think what we would say is, well, either the electricity when I put through the water changed it. It didn't just pull it apart. It changed it. It modified the atoms and therefore modified the molecules. And that isn't really what it is. And contrary to our belief, not only does H2O do all those functions, but sodium quadroxide does all those functions. And there are two things that can do all those functions. Because I'm going to identify water, I've got to identify both on the basis of the functions and on the basis of the samples. If, on the other hand, I did a direct chemical analysis of what's in the cup, well, this would be parallel. If it comes apart and it comes out to be H2O, and then I took artificial H2O and I applied it to plants and all the rest, it didn't do any of the functions, then again, I wouldn't be able to say that water is H2O. So I need a double test to see whether water is H2O, as opposed for sound, where I only need a single test. And in fact, water passes the double test. Are we together so far? Yeah. That could certainly be. That could certainly be. Absolutely. Absolutely. And one way you would discover that is if the functions came apart. Now, the crucial question is this: what is experience like? Consciousness. Is consciousness like sound, or is consciousness like water? This is the crucial question. When we decide that, we'll know which pattern to apply to trying to fill the gap between the correlation and the assertion that consciousness is just what the brain does. Shall we fill it in a sound way, or should we fill it in the water way? That's the question that we have to now address. Okay? Those are the two that I'm aware of anyway, where science has uncontroversially succeeded in arriving at an identification. If these two don't work, then what we will have to say is the claim, the conviction that consciousness is what the brain does, that claim is at present without foundation. The fact that it's without foundation doesn't mean it's false, but it means it's without foundation. And people who claim it confidently as if it were obviously true are doing something inappropriate. So what they should say is, we think it, we hope it's true because we're materialists and we'd like it to be true, but we really don't have scientific reason to conclude that it's true. And that would be a reform in their presentation, and it would be a much more reasonable position, I think. But those are the only two that we have available for doing identifications. So let's ask two questions. Is your consciousness something like water where we have samples in addition to knowing all the things that it does? Or is consciousness like sound where we have no samples? The whole concept of consciousness is, well, there's something that does all these functions, and consciousness, whatever that might be, whatever it could be, whatever you find, consciousness of whatever that might be. What kind of concept is it? And this is what Thomas Nagel calls the hole in the concept, where when you ask, what is Q? The answer is, well, I'll tell you what I know goes on, and my concept of Q is the thing, whatever it is, that does those jobs. When I ask somebody what consciousness is do I get an answer like that? Here's a bunch of things that are getting done in the environment, and consciousness is whatever does all those things. Or is consciousness like water and say, here's some. You can see it yourself. Now, even in philosophy, there's prejudice about this, but I think it's glaringly obvious that consciousness is like water. It's not like sound. You're conscious right now. You're having conscious experiences right now. Do I have to say, I don't know what consciousness is? It's only the thing, whatever it is, that does X, Y, Z. You're experiencing it every waking moment. And sometimes when you're asleep also, when you have dreams, you're also conscious. So the idea that it's purely functional is beyond taken seriously. Which would mean that in order to fill the gap with consciousness in the brain, you have to do two things. You'd have to show that the brain does all the things that consciousness does, number one, that it functionally matches consciousness, but also you'd have to show that I have reason to think my direct experience is something in the brain. I have to show that independently. And if, final sentence, and I'll take the question, and if you got a match between the functions of consciousness and what the brain does, but you didn't get any reason whatsoever to think that my toothache and my itch and my desire and my thought about infinity is something going on in the brain, then you don't have the double match. If you don't have the double match, you don't have adequate reason to say that it is what's going on in the brain. Why should I do that? Why? We're trying to understand what consciousness is. Maybe, if you play the skeptical game, maybe you're the only thing that's conscious. Then we're only interested in your consciousness because that's all there is. But we're interested in consciousness, wherever it is. Why would it matter to me if I were the only conscious thing in the universe? I'd still want to know what my consciousness is, how it's related to my body, and how to understand it. So I don't think I need to have direct access to other people's consciousness. Second of all, I think we have plenty of evidence of people being conscious, so I don't think we need direct access in order to have good reason to believe it. But that's a separate issue. That's a controversial issue. But for the purpose of this project, even if I'm dealing with only my own consciousness, the exact same question exists. Yeah. there are things that exist that aren't physical. Everybody, I mean, most people agree to that. Numbers, qualities, sets, and mathematics. There are all sorts of things that don't have to be physical. Maybe using the word samples is creating a misimpression here. Let's say I'm directly acquainted with items in the group. In the case of sound, 200 years ago, somebody would say, "Show me a sound. Describe a sound to me." The only thing he could say is, "I can tell you what it does. I don't know what it is." So there's that. When you explain your understanding of sound, there's that whole built-in. Sound is whatever does ABC. Consciousness isn't like that. When you tell me what consciousness is, you press his finger and say, "That's what it is." What you're feeling now is consciousness. I'm presenting him with consciousness. I don't say consciousness whatever it does X, Y, Z. That's the. Let me give you some of the functions, so maybe that will help. I'm watching somebody. Somebody steps on his toe, and the next thing that happens is he's yelling. How did that happen? He stepped on his toe, now he's yelling. So from the point of view of consciousness, we say he felt pain. That's why he's yelling. And somebody says, okay, you get from stepping on the toe to yelling, and you tell me that consciousness in between is what gets you from one to the other. That's something that consciousness does. Now you say I can trace a brain circuit from the nerve endings in the toe up to the brain, up to the processing part, up to the decisive part, out to the muscles of the throat and the lungs. Well, you see, this transition from toe to yell, which you say consciousness does, I say is done by the transition in the body through the brain. Okay, one thing at a time. So now, when it happens, the question is, how does it happen, right? So I say, well, okay, that's something that consciousness does. And you're saying that this is done, in fact, by the transition through the brain. Okay, that means, in this case, the transition through the brain matches a function that consciousness has. And there are many other such transitions like that. Imagine, this isn't true today, but imagine that all of the functions that you think consciousness performs, you could map in the brain. Okay. That would be like sound. You've got to match to all the functions. The difference is, with sound, you start with sound is whatever does the functions. And in the case of consciousness, you don't start with consciousness whatever does the functions. Whatever it is, I have no clue what it is, but just whatever does it. No, because in the case of consciousness, when you feel the pressure of the table on your hand, that's conscious experience. So conscious experience has two roles. It does things, and it's also something that you have directly accessible to. I don't know if it's physical or not. That's part of the question we're issuing. I don't know the concept. So in the case of consciousness, it won't be enough to show that brain activity does the functions. You have to also have some reason to think that brain activity is what the consciousness is. What could the alternative be? The alternative could be that consciousness is somewhere else, and the brain activity mirrors what's going on there. That's the way the alternative would work. But at any rate, the pattern that we want, I think, is the water pattern, and therefore it's important to investigate the analysis of consciousness as brain events from both sides, from how it functions, and also from the side of the character of the thing itself. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Let me take a few minutes just to go off on a tangent of your question, because this may help forestall certain types of difficulties over and over again. There is a feeling that any discussion can and should be halted when the words used in the discussion aren't defined. That's the challenge of usually the neophyte philosopher. Define your terms. And if you can't define your terms, then people feel there's something wrong with the discussion. Something's going off the rails, and nothing can really be accomplished. To start by defining your terms. That move in discussion is a mistake. It's a mistake. And I'll show you that it's a mistake. And what I'm saying now, again, is not controversial in professional philosophy. I'll show you that it's a mistake. Suppose that we're correct. If you don't define the terms, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. Your whole discussion is incomplete. Well, one of the things we do is search for definitions. Find your terms. Well, okay, I'll try. Truth is hard, and justice is hard, and knowledge is hard. We're working on it for thousands of years, and we're still working. It's hard, but we'll try. Okay, how do you try? How do you try to find a definition? Well, let's see. You take, for example, truth. Okay. I think truth is Q. Somebody says, let's see, truth is Q, but look, Q does this and truth doesn't, so maybe it's not, Aren't you using truth in the attempt to find the definition of truth? If you really didn't understand truth, no clue what truth is, if you're not competent to discuss truth at all without a prior definition, you couldn't look for the definition. You wouldn't be able to conduct the discussion. You wouldn't be able to say, that's a good suggestion, we'll change the definition, or no, it's not good because for these reasons. So something's wrong with thinking that without a definition you can't discuss anything using the term, because the attempt to find a definition is a discussion using the term. So the truth is something like this. Every term has black, white, and gray areas. I think it's true for every term. Even ones that people think are really precise, but you usually find vague areas. They're vague areas, they're gray areas. And the search for a definition works roughly like this. Yes, if you're a professional philosopher, there are a few clear. But it works roughly like this. Somebody proposes a definition, and you say, let's try the black and white areas and see whether it fits. If it fits the black and white areas, it passed the first test. Now, you're going to apply the definition to the gray areas, see whether it applies to the gray areas in a way that clarifies it, gives you better understanding, helps sort out which of the grays are really black and which of the grays are really white, does it in a way that explains what's going on. If it passes that test, then it's a good candidate for a definition of the concept. Notice that the black and white areas are being used as the first condition to test whether it's an adequate definition. Okay, now, we're conducting a discussion using this term, and I say, I've been very careful to keep the term being used in only the black and white areas. I haven't gone to the gray areas. The black and white areas are what you're going to use to test the proposed definition. So I think then I don't need a definition in order to conduct the discussion. I've kept the use of the term in areas where we feel confident that we do understand it without a definition. If I slip into the gray area, then I've made a mistake. If somebody points out, look, you've used the term in this context, not everybody agrees what it means in that context, so you're trading in the gray area, that's when you could demand a definition. But as we stay with the black and white areas, we don't need a definition. There's an appendix in my book. So I think that I'm not saying anything about consciousness which is in the gray area. I'm using something like a toothache. I think some of the things. Maybe toothaches aren't really conscious, Maybe they're really unconscious, or maybe they're just snails crawling on the ground, butterflies, making a terrible mistake. I don't think people think about that. There's something like brain processing, of which you're only partially conscious, or things that you only get when you're asleep, or there are all sorts of things you have on drugs. There are ways to get into the gray area, and I have to be careful not to stray into the gray area. But if I don't stray into the gray area, my example is this: there's no accepted definition of truth. Surprise. There's no definition. So now, George is is a witness in a murder case, and he says he observed the murder in New York, such a date and time, and for Jewish law, two people come in and say, George, how could you say that you observed that murder? You were with us in Beijing that date, that time. George, you're in trouble. You're lying under oath in court. You're going to be prosecuted for perjury. And George says, Perjury, Your Honor. Perjury means not telling the truth. What's your definition of truth, Your Honor? You don't have one? Then you can't prosecute me for perjury because clearly you don't have a definition of truth. I don't think George will get off. I think he's going to be put in jail for perjury. We understand very well what truth means when we're talking about where you were when. And if questions about future truths or unknowable truths are gray, yeah, they're gray. But that doesn't mean that we can't use it in catching a person in perjury. So I don't believe that I'm using the word consciousness in a prejudicial way. I could be wrong. Somebody show me where that strayed into the gray area. That would be interesting to discuss. Yeah. Don't take it that strictly. Okay. Don't take it that strictly. That's right. So all I want is evidence that this thing in my cup is H2O. Maybe you get it by drinking it, and maybe you get it by pouring it on salt. I don't know how you get it, but you need direct evidence that this stuff is H2O. It's not enough to do the functional job, that H2O will do all the things that water will do. It's also you gotta give me some reason to think that what's in the cup is H2O. In the case of water, it's electrolysis that does it. Maybe there are other ways to do it as well, but I know that electrolysis is used to do it. I'm not into taking things apart into their parts. Though I will talk that talk with respect to consciousness, as you will see, but that's not because it's in the concept of reduction. The concept of reduction is just give me independent reason to think the samples are what you say they are. No, you don't want to say that. Now you're going directly. Yeah, because you lost it, right? So, but look, let's just take a step back and see if we can look at this in the terms that I've been presenting, right? What you presented now is an example of a correlation. You hit the guy in the head, and that had an effect on his consciousness. That's evidence of correlation. That's where we started from. We started from evidence of correlation. I allowed the assumption, which I don't think is true, I allowed the assumption that we do have a correlation between what happens in the brain and the things that happen in consciousness. The question was going from there to identity. So you're just giving another example of what I'm taking for granted as universal. Because they're not asserting correlation. Correlation is the evidence. The person says thunder. The only thing that we know that causes thunder is lightning. We've done a lot of experimental observation. Therefore, thunder is lightning. Is lightning identical? No, they're just matched. It means whenever you have thunder, you can check that it was lightning. Whenever you have lightning, you can check that it was thunder. Right? That's all it means. You don't get beyond that to the being identical. You don't go that route. You don't try to go that route. We're not trying to look for other causes. We're trying to look for reason to think there aren't two things. There's only one thing. It's a much more radical move that they're making. Consciousness is what goes on under your cranium. That's a big move, and I'm looking for the reason for that move. This isn't new. John Locke has a whole argument about this 50 years ago. So, what we would need to do now, if we're going to work on the sample side, is either to start with conscious experience, and somehow analyze it somehow to see that right around the corner, behind the shade, there are neurons hiding. Really, this thing that I'm this toothache, or this thought of Vienna, or this desire for ice cream, these things are really neurons firing. So if I look at the experience carefully enough, analyze it fairly enough, just see it sort of moving in the neuron direction. So they get grayer and grayer, and squishier and squishier, and microscopic, and I'll sort of push it, and I'll see that, that's sort of what makes it up. That's sort of what builds it up. That's one thing. Or, and go into the brain and start peeking around to the brain and think, okay, this is where auditory processing takes place, this is where visual processing takes place, and this is a feeling of pain. This chunk of brain firing this way is the feeling of pain, or is the thought of Vienna, or is the desire for ice cream. I'm going to see pains and thoughts and desires in the brain, in the wiring of the brain. When you look at the wiring a certain way, sometimes you look at the wiring and see a square, sometimes you see a circular array, and sometimes you see a pain array, and you see a desire array, just different types of arrays. You'll see that in the brain. One is analyzing experience to see the brain, the other is analyzing the brain to see experience. Well, this sort of thing has been thought about, and been written about. I think that at present, everybody, I don't know the entire literature, but almost everybody thinks that both processes are hopeless. They're absolutely hopeless. Let's try hunting for neurons in experience. I'm going to start doing something similar to what you said, but only from this perspective. Let's take a visual experience. So I have a visual experience of this room. And in the experience, there are many different objects and many different colors and many different textures and different distances. All these are features of the experience. Okay, let's simplify. Just put up a cloth that's a uniform blue. Okay, now the things are different, the texture is just a uniform blue. I'm looking at blue. Okay, now that simplifies it tremendously. There's so much complication to take into account. Now they tell you that colors visually and physically composed of hue, brightness, and something else. Hue is what we call the color. Brightness is a third feature which I forget at the moment. So let's mentally just hue. Blue as opposed to green and yellow, chartreuse and purple, just the blueness of it. Okay, so now I've gotten down to the simplest visual experience. There's no object there, just blue. Do you see the neurons peeking out behind the corner? Do you see neurons under the blue, in the blue? When you look very carefully at the blue, you sort of see little sparks of electrical firings where the synapses transmit ions in the brain. I don't think you do. You just experience blue. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any progress in the neuron direction by cutting out the whole picture and having just the color, and then dividing the color into the three parts and looking just at the hue. It gets simpler and it changes, but it doesn't change in the direction of neurons. Where in your experience, someone would call this phenomenology, where in your experience do you have any hint that it's neurons that are doing it? If you had a theory that it was soap bubbles on your skin, you couldn't tell the difference by examining the inner quality of your experience. You get no information at all. We happen to think it's the brain because of the experiments we've done opening up the brain. And by the way, it wasn't always so. There is a theory that goes back to somewhere in the ancient Greeks that the brain is the body's radiator. It just radiates heat because it has lots of surface area, right? So it can expand. They eat very quickly, right? And thought was in the heart. That's why it's always, and even our literature speaks that way. When you have an exciting thought, your heart starts beating quickly. That's a correlation, isn't it, between thinking and the heart? When you're sad, So, when you examine the experience, sort of feel and see in the experience, neurons. There's nothing like that goes on. Doesn't seem like that is going to be what does it. Let's try it the other way. Here, that Locke and others imagine a microscopic person touring the brain, walking in the brain and observing what he sees. Well, of course, they had no clue how complex the brain was at that time. But it's some kind of machine. With pure, that's the whole point of the exercise. Some kind of machine operating mechanical function. We think it's an electrical machine. Going from neuron to neuron, bundles of neurons, and some are firing faster and some are firing slower, some fire and stop firing. Some bundles are connected to other bundles, and some bundles are fairly isolated. Okay. Different kinds of stuff. You know, you've got the corpus callosum joining the two hemispheres, and then you have the two hemispheres. Yeah, going from one to the other. And by the way, how much they understand. There are about 86 billion neurons. About 2 years ago, they discovered that glial cells, which they were just housekeepers to get rid of dirt and pollution, also participate in information processing. And there are about another 86 billion of those. So now you got 172 billion information processors in the brain. Just went up by 100%. Isn't that grand? That means it's much more complex than we thought. And who knows what discoveries are coming out around the corner. So you're looking at the neurons, you're looking at the glial cells, the compositions of them. You know, okay, so some are bigger, some are smaller, some have more electricity, less electricity. How about pain? Seeing pain, identifying pain. This is the pain. Not something correlated with the pain that somebody told me because he told me he was in pain. No, I don't know anything about what people have. I don't know what they feel. I just see, there it is, it's pain right in front of you. No one can even imagine what that would be like. There's nothing in observing the physical goings on that gives you a reason to identify it as pain or anything else. It's only because when people say they're in pain, and you know from the MRI that this part of the brain is operating, now I know that that they're correlated. But when you look at the brain itself, you don't see any of these bonds. So we are not getting any good reason to think that the samples of consciousness, the actual experiences of consciousness we all have, are things in the brain. That being the case, we're not able to make the identification the way science makes the identification. If that's the case, at the very least we could say, at the present time, there's not adequate reason to think that conscious experience is what the brain does. It's correlated, but not what the brain does. Will they figure out some other stuff in the future? Sure, they could. But in the meantime, to assert it as if it's been demonstrated is simply wrong. It hasn't been demonstrated at all. The kinds of information you need to close the door here, we don't have. That's the first step we got. I have more positive things to say, but that's the first step. Okay, so that's what we'll put on the table for today. Tomorrow we'll start with a review, and we'll push on.